Hey, hi everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to the Magic of Change Management, the second in our 4-webinar series on the human side of DAM. I'm Sarah Brylowski, Chair of San Jose State University School of Information Chapter of ASIST. We are very lucky to have this great session put on by 3 thought leaders in DAM. We have Jill Talvensaari, a senior marketing leader, executive coach, nonprofit board member, and digital experience industry expert. Kathleen Cameron, who is the digital asset manager of global marketing ops at Google and who has a professional interest in the digital asset lifecycle management. Also presenting is Robin Parisse, media therapist who helps senior Fortune 500 leaders simplify complex technology and processes for continuous growth and success. Before I give it away to our presenters tonight, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep yourself muted during the presentation. As questions pop up, go ahead and enter them into the chat window, and our panelists will address them throughout the session. We do have a couple interactive surveys that will launch as pop-ups. If you're connecting with something with a screen, we encourage you to participate in those. So I'll give it away to our panelists.
Okay, hello everybody. It's great to be here. Do you want to go ahead and start our first slide? So tonight's agenda, we're going to go over change management, and we'll be talking about it in particular with its relationship to digital asset management. But everything you hear here tonight around change management really talks about how humans, processes, and technology can coexist happily and with the constant change that we see both in society as well as technology and all of our driving factors behind that. We're going to give you some keys to make magic happen when it comes to change management. I'm going to go ahead and launch the first polling survey. So the question is, do you have any project management experience? Let's give a minute for everybody to respond. So what's the verdict?
Okay. Can everyone see the results?
No.
Oh, 86% have project management experience and 14% are not yet, but are working on it.
Excellent. So those of you that have had project management experience know that change is just part of that job. And actually on that note, Kathleen and Robin, do you want to add maybe even your favorite story around change management and project management?
Sure. I recently was in a 2-day change management workshop because I think it's always good to have a refresher. And I realized as I was sitting there that what they were describing was project management, kind of in its very basic elements. And I thought, oh, I know this. This is good. So it's good to know that there's that correlation, that it's important to, set scope, and that a lot of the same processes around change management are in fact just project management.
Definitely. I also was part of a morning workshop where we were going through a lot of change that's happening in the organization. And so we went through this exercise called Stinky Fish to help everyone air their concerns and the elephant in the room and that sort of thing. And it was amazing how much more open people were in creating that safe environment to embrace the change. It gave everyone a new perspective. So that was really cool to see that that can happen too.
Mm-hmm.
So my most favorite story, I have so many, so I think we should move to the next slide because I think that project management and change management are hand in hand.
So do you want to go ahead and launch the next poll, Sarah? So this one's a test. When do you think that change management starts during the DAM life cycle? At the beginning, middle, end, or all of the above? Let's give everyone a minute to submit their answer. And what are you seeing, Sarah?
We're 72% complete. So I'll go ahead and close that.
Oh, now we can see. Cool. So beginning, all of the above. Yeah. So both. I mean, Robin, do you want to go ahead and jump into change management and talk about its
Sure.
how it changes throughout the process?
Well, I think if we lock it into only one definition, then we're missing the point because it's a continuous process. You can't have digital asset management initiatives without change management, and you also need project management. They go hand in hand, as we just heard a second ago. So when you're starting a digital asset management project and maybe you're the assigned person leading it, it's really a good idea to step back and understand how you're going to set your approach as the change manager with the teams and stakeholders and champions in your organization that you're leading that effort for.
Yeah, and I think that as people managing these programs, you have to accept that change is inevitable. It's going to happen. Either if you're in academia, there's going to be a new VP or chancellor. They may have different ideas. If you're in the corporate sector and you're in a startup, change is constant. Even in big tech, change is constant. So once you accept that change is constant, I think it helps you understand how to work with your stakeholders in acknowledging that change is difficult, but it is a factor you have to consider when you're managing these types of programs.
Do you want to comment on whether change has to come from the top, bottom, or middle, or what you've seen be most successful?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, go ahead, Robin.
I was going to say, I tend to come in as a consultant to end user clients, and I become that catalyst of change to start to move things forward. It's usually a champion who's put the dollars together and said yes to a stakeholder. But I do think you need all players. It's push-pull, and it's not just push-pull. You have to be the person that is educating forward, because a lot of folks think they understand digital asset management, but they don't understand how many areas of the business it touches and how many ways you can optimize your investment in digital asset management. So again, if you don't have the top and you don't have the bottom, you need to find them, because it is continuous spectrum of engagement.
For sure. I will say that I've never seen any types of these initiatives be successful unless the imperative comes from the top down.
Absolutely. So if you don't have that top-down support that's communicating out across the organization saying this is now a mandate or this is a great thing, and being a champion for you, the chances of success in implementing these kinds of changes is much less.
Definitely. And that's why understanding your organization becomes critical, because you can't have the right conversations consistently unless you identify those things.
Right. So there's a question if we have any specific tips for managing up. And I think it comes down to engagement. And sometimes we can't always get in front of leadership, but it's important to at least try, or to at least have your manager champion it on up. Just depends on the kind of organization you're in and whether or not you've got access to that top tier of leadership, or if you have to manage your manager to have them manage up.
Right. And sometimes it's sitting down with whoever you're reporting to ask them questions about how they like to communicate to their person in that they report to, and how often, and set a tone for how you're going to communicate ongoing, and how you're going to prepare your manager to have the right conversation to represent you in the project, as well as consistency.
Right. And I recently got advice that it's important as that program manager to put together the headline that you want leadership to speak to. Like, give them the talking points.
Mm-hmm.
and then you can help control the conversation where you don't necessarily want them winging it, because they're probably never going to be in there, first of all, but you do want them to speak to the people that need to hear from them with the words you want. So you can help them by giving them that headline or that, quick statement, to say, this is how we're going to talk about this, and this is why it's important.
Yeah, I've seen that referred to more as like the coherence, that something that so that everyone knows exactly what needs to happen to be successful and what down to the individual person needs to occur for it to take place.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. And sometimes when I've put these things together, and I do it all the time, where there's, a 3 bullet point email update bi-weekly, but there's a monthly meeting where we have the timeline, we have, things that were done, completed on our project plan. So a update on, yes, we got it done, or Jeopardy. So that kind of green, yellow, red light kind of visual. PowerPoint in terms of that kind of page, as well as what are we looking at for next month or next 2 weeks. And then also a mitigation and strategies. So if you know in advance, like say an unreasonable date or an unreasonable budget is put forward, you can state that as a mitigation and recommend, a Jeopardy and recommend a mitigation strategy. And putting that in a document that's visual, that's consistent to update, is a great way of having the conversation when it's outside of people and they're responding to what's on the page, and you're consistently building your story and being honest and transparent. But I also think the other side goes too, where you need to be transparent to your users and have different mechanisms, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as we move forward in the slides, about how to communicate to the greater good and create ambassadors.
Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this starts to speak to, what parts of project management are going to be your best practices for empowering the change to take place. Do you want to talk a little bit about the difference between engagement versus communications?
Sure, and we talked a little bit about this during the last session as well, in the importance of having key stakeholders that are going to be your champions, and then those are the people that you're engaging. But communications has to happen on a broad basis. So in a large organization, you want to have a newsletter and regular emails and posters or events or something that gets the message out there in a lot of different ways, because people are busy, and the psychology behind that is they only hear what's relevant to them in the moment. So you want to try to continue to broadcast out on a lot of different channels while you're engaging your key stakeholder group, and they kind of form your governance committee sometimes.
Exactly. I wanted to dig a little bit more though, Robin, into what you were talking about, where you have an ongoing existing document where people can go and comment and explore ideas together, because one of the challenges I think we see today is, somebody spends a lot of time, they may even go off and do research, they come back and they've put, hours and hours into a presentation, and then people feel like they immediately have to comment on this person's work that might have taken them months, and in 1 hour it's actually trashed or questioned and put aside. So I do think there's some value into posting a document and letting people digest it.
So I think I'm going to be like the chorus to what Kathleen just said, is that you have to have a communication strategy and plan for the greater audience, and be consistent and transparent on, if I'm going to launch a jam that on X date, or I'm going to have a rollout strategy, you set expectation for whatever that is, and you keep updates consistent, whether it's to the management in those 3 slides that go to them, as well as to the greater good. In terms of one person working alone and their feedback not being acknowledged, I really try to have core working groups of people, and that depends. Say you have a metadata taxonomy team, and it's one person from each division that is a librarian that joins that group, and they work together to be the kind of speakers or the point of contact for their, you know, business area. So doing that in terms of having your core group, but then extending that out in terms of having a constant loop of communication, whether it's generating ideas or asking for feedback, that people know how to do that consistently at every stage of the project. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Jill, exactly, because it sounded like somebody was producing a document, presenting it, and they're on the stage and people aren't listening. So I'm hoping never to get to that stage in these projects. Kathleen, have you had that problem before where somebody's worked really hard for that one thing and never gotten the feedback that's positive?
Sure.
Okay.
An example. Sorry, I'm pausing while I'm processing an example. So let's talk about success first, and then while I try to think of a good failure.
Okay.
So I've used wikis, I've used intranets to really share the scope of the project and how the changes are going to get managed. And so that is a space that everyone in your org usually can access. Then they know who the key stakeholders are. So if there is somebody designated in their particular area, they know who to go to for additional information and support. But you can also track the scope of what your program is, and that may evolve. And then you can also track what's evolving, as well as your stakeholders, as well as what that executive summary is. Like, what is the program and the mission statement and the vision statement? And then you manage accordingly against those things, because those should be your cornerstones of your program, and those probably aren't going to change. How people get there might, and then you can manage the change through one of those intranet type of things where there is a document. I had put up a wiki in a former job 11 years ago, and periodically I will still get a call from somebody at that library who's like, do you remember where that documentation is? And I'll say, is the wiki still there? And they'll say, yes. And I'm like, go to the wiki.
Yeah.
But I've also had the experience where I've spun up a program, thought I had the right support in place, and I didn't, and it didn't move forward very fast.
Yeah, so I think it's a combination. I think also that depending on which company it is, so they'll have a scope of work that runs through their IT technology group or a charter that you have to define the project or the initiative, and it's just one of their base governance practices. So I think
Yes.
it ties into, how do you manage governance for the organization you're at? How do you manage communication so you're communicating up, down, sideways, and you're really looking at all those channels? I mean, the workforce today has more generations at one time than ever before, and people expect to hear things differently, and so you want to overlap and use every channel that's available to you, but consistency and transparency is critical, I think.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really important point, that people are going to take in that information via different modalities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the bottom line that is being heard loud and clear is that over communicating, but communicating extremely consistently with coherence is the key to the success of these projects.
Exactly.
I think also too is upfront saying, I'm not sure how this is going to work. I'm doing due diligence and this might be a jeopardy, and really having those mitigation strategies for something you think is a problem before it becomes, this big problem. So if you're transparent and you're working in that modality of really checking in, being upfront and very focused. I mean, you don't have to give an executive every little tactical detail of your project plan, but you do need to roll up appropriately so that it's not a surprise and that you've over communicated in the right way. I mean, Kathleen, I'm sure you have some examples where there's been jeopardies on a project. How have you handled them?
Sure. So I worked on a project a few years back where I had a fully fleshed out project plan. I had the executive sponsor sign off on it. I had buy-in from multiple levels of the organization. And as the project progressed, there were some personnel changes that kind of became a blocker. And at that point, communicating to the executive sponsors became a real challenge because it felt to them like the scope was changing when it wasn't. And the project kind of blew up because of that. Even though the scoping document didn't evolve, parts of the process did, and they weren't able to adapt to understanding what that change was, even though it was really just a personnel change.
I think it goes back to that people don't handle change overall. We're human.
Exactly.
We like things structured and repeatable. So we have to be mindful of that as damn, people.
Yes.
All the time.
Yeah. And be adaptable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because, if we acknowledge change is inevitable and we acknowledge that we're working with a very diverse environment in any organization we're in, we as program managers have to constantly be adapting, right?
Right. And I love this next slide because, acknowledgement. I mean, I don't know about you, all of you on the phone, but don't we like it when somebody has acknowledged that they heard you?
Yes, that goes such a long way. To, just say, we know change is hard. How is change hard for you, Jill, to your stinky fish example? Or, I've held design thinking workshops around, we're having a big change. And then you start with the question, what is most painful for you about the current process? And you just have people write ideas down on sticky notes, and then you move on of what would make the process better. And then ask them to think big, like think wild, think the craziest idea possible, and then get to reality. And that creative process really opens up dialogue in an interesting way.
Yeah, an exercise I did recently for a group, I started opposite. I had everybody take 6 minutes or 10 minutes to write down what they thought success looked like in 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then we went around the room virtually as well as physically with folks. And each person got to tell us their bullet points, and they weren't allowed to comment until everybody in the room and on the phone had been done. And then we had a discussion. And out of that came this feeling of, we can do this together, and we want so many of the same things, because they were a diverse group of stakeholders. And I thought it was really fun because we all know our pain points, which we also did that later on. But to start with, sometimes, what do you think success is like in the future? If you're sitting there in the future, why is it good? Then go back to, why is it bad?
Yeah,
sure. The only mistake I see that happens there is occasionally one group of key stakeholders will get left out because someone says up front, oh yeah, this system change isn't going to impact them. I saw this happen with an ID system that was being rolled out across millions of users, and one large segment was left out. So we had to go back and re-engineer the solution, as well as basically figure out a phased rollout worldwide. It was crazy how much redo we had to do just because we had forgotten about one large group of stakeholders.
Yeah, so that, for every good example, there's one where we can learn something, but even from the good examples, we can learn something from doing that, because change is constant. And unfortunately, we do make mistakes, but acknowledging them, that probably didn't feel good, Jill, at all.
Well, it was more because they got left out, and so that made them angry. So one of the things that I took away from that is include as many people as possible, even if they think it doesn't affect them, and then let them decide if it doesn't affect them. don't make the decisions for them.
Right.
Yeah. So you end up with a kind of large room to start with, and then you funnel down from there for who's really impacted.
Sure. I also find that thinking broadly when you're rolling out a digital asset management tool gives you the most flexibility. So when you find those forgotten teams, it's easy to include them.
Yeah, I kind of take the same approach, Kathleen, because typically I'm an outsider coming in, so I don't understand their culture, their company, and I might miss something. So I try to ask, well, how do you work with this person? Who's your internal customers? So getting that really broad understanding of the company as part of the process might open up those blinders a little wider up front.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of that acknowledging that change is hard is being patient. I find that I'm repeating myself a lot with the same key stakeholders because they don't understand digital asset management. They know it's important, but because they haven't been in it, it's less tangible for them. And so I find that it's really important to take a breath and just patiently re-explain it again. And knowing that change is hard, and that they will get it once it becomes a little more tangible, but to just keep on and not get frustrated. Because the minute you get frustrated, your stakeholders are going to check out.
Yeah, I count to 3. I have to practice, all the time being patient. There is a question here about what is the best practice for making your stakeholders aware that one asset, I think it means that one digital asset management system will work better for your organization instead of simply going with what is the latest new thing.
So Kathleen B, do you mean one asset or one asset system? Because I've been in both positions, so we can answer it both ways. If it's an asset, if you've got a large digital library and you're trying to highlight which assets you think have the most value, it depends on the tool. Some tools will let you rank the asset, so it's kind of like a voting strategy, how many likes an asset gets. You can also create collections in almost every digital asset management tool to say, these are our hero assets. We would prefer you to start there before you go digging through the repository. Any other thoughts, ladies?
Yeah, I think bonus points for assets that actually collect their own social media reach so that you can actually predict, in the future, you can look at your past assets and go, this one performed the best. We should do more like this. Here's why.
Right. And then that's getting the data back, which is an additional change for your users because they're used to scrambling for the data.
Right.
In terms of how do you track actual usage, right?
Right. So that would get to, that's, I think, is a really big thing now and will get to be more mainstream, that you're pulling in ancillary data on performance at all your media outlets back to individual assets, groups of assets, and campaigns. So that whole reporting mechanism and how you're going to present it to your audience needs to be defined.
Yep.
Because if you give too much information to one audience, they might not be able to digest it, and you want them to be able to have the information to make good business decisions in the future, or as well as acknowledge what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And in regards to picking a digital asset management system and having your stakeholders engaged, I have found that it's good to first meet with the stakeholders and talk through basic requirements and get a list of basic requirements, and then start to show them a few tools so that they can understand more in depth what the capabilities are, and then extend your requirements from there, and then go off, do a little more due diligence and really evaluate a bunch of tools before you re-engage your stakeholders, narrow it down, and then have them participate in demos or have the vendors set up demo environments so they can go dig in. I find often your stakeholders aren't going to go and really actively check out a demo instance though.
True.
Right. So they usually never do. As a consultant, I am asked noticed a lot lately, actually, which is interesting, before we even get started on requirements, before they even kicking off the project for real, sometimes when they're thinking about it, is to do a marketplace overview. And,
Mm-hmm.
you know, what's the landscape today? And so I'm able to pull in my view and other subject matter experts' view for conversation against analyst reports, against how I've understood them. And then we get into a very open discussion about the possibilities and what were they thinking as they came into the room. So it's a little different approach, but I always get to the requirements and identifying the best flavor of vendor that might match their culture, because it's not just a solution, it's how, you know, it's kind of that Apple or Microsoft thing. Which one are you more like?
Yeah.
That used to be a huge differentiator. Now it's not. But DAMs come in a lot of flavors.
They sure do. That one thing I'd say from you having been on the systems integrator side of things and been a seller of multiple DAMs would be that when you see really well-written requirements, that there's almost only one or two DAMs that even make sense.
Yeah.
Definitely.
The thing I don't want to move on to the next slide yet until we go through the benefits of saying no. I wanted to, this gets to Tig's question around, you know, what's the risk of staying as is? And so if you think about not having change and staying as is, it's, you've got structure and process in place. Hopefully they work really well. Usually they don't work, you know, more than 80% well. But everyone knows what's expected and everything goes on as normal. But you'll also notice there's no innovation going on. So what's super interesting about points of major change or new systems like this coming into place and processes getting, you know, automated and reimagined is that you have these infinite possibilities, because the minute you say yes to some direction, you're completely committed and now everything locks down again, versus when you say no and keep thinking, everything's open and you can entertain those crazy off the wall ideas like you were talking about, Kathleen.
Yeah. I think there's a range of change, right? So
That's
there's
right.
going to be little changes and then there are going to be big changes. There are going to be changes that come from your third-party vendor if you're licensing a tool that you have almost no control over. And then there are the changes you do have control over, right? So what I find is that often the changes I'm in control of and I'm making are to the benefit of my users, right? I'm not just randomly saying, I'm going to make this change and, you know,
Right.
ruin
Right.
your
Like,
Thought about it.
yeah. I take that in. And when I'm talking to people and training them, I let them know this is a tool for them and that it's constantly evolving. And I need their feedback to make it work for them because I'm in a service position, right?
Yep.
It's a little bit harder if you are making a major change. If you are completely restructuring your dam, or you're deploying a dam for the first time, or your dam vendor folds and you have to find a new one, or you break the dam and you have to find a new one.
right.
Which I've done
So,
twice.
yep.
Or a fun
yeah.
one I had at my last job was it's a big inflection point event, and we have lots of content we've been producing for 6 to 9 months, and someone in IT decides to upgrade our content platform, like, you know, 2 weeks before the event.
Yep.
Probably not the best decision.
Right.
No, not
Or
at all.
that IT person that swore they were backing up your content every week hasn't actually done it for 3 months and something hits your servers and they go down.
Right.
Yeah.
It really depends on the quality of the change, I guess. How you spin that story, right? Sometimes it's better to stay as is so that you're collecting consistent data because somebody wants to report out on that data. That's definitely an argument for not making a change.
Sure. You'd wait till the end of the reporting period at a minimum, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Or run them in parallel. There's all kinds of ways around it, but
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you have to weigh really what's best for the organization and your stakeholders versus, and then validate that the change is really important, right? For those changes that you can control.
So the other part of it too is I think that as we're talking about the change of DAM with artificial intelligence and other factors and bringing analytics back in, we used to all name our projects and buy the DAM solution we were buying and saying this is a DAM project. A lot of folks now are doing naming programs for an ecosystem, not a solution. And when you're doing change in an ecosystem and you're setting it up for change and moderating that change as the administrators, you have to. There's just no way you can't. But again, it's about an ecosystem, and we don't want to see people getting locked to one dam versus having a dam that they like, because you never want to be that story that they tell about their bad experience. Your dam only gets, the first chance to make a good impression. You don't get a second chance.
Mm-hmm. Which brings us to building trust.
Good segue, Jill.
Yes.
So some things we talked about were, how do you unleash the power of your special forces within the organization? And then are there things you can do, like what are the strengths within a culture and how do you harness them? I think these things all go into building trust.
Well, also, as an outsider, every engagement I do has to start with that they can trust me. So I build relationship, I build bridges between silos. I, have conversations with a lot of different people, and I bring different people together. I once had an experience where nobody talked to each other from one group to the other, and I don't mean group, how do I say this? One was in, a business area, say over here, and they had a unique business that didn't have any relationship to the other business. And so they never talked to each other. And when they had to, it was through like email or through a third party. They were all under the same umbrella. But then all of a sudden there was this huge shift in the organization, and they wanted to bring 6 groups together that never had communications. And most of them had been there. I think the only person that had a short stint was there for 12 years. Most of the folks have been there over 30 years. And they really had an idea of the other person's reaction before they were able to even have an action. So building trust was really interesting because you had to introduce them to each other, even though they work for the same company. So a lot of times building trust is at that base level of having coffee, getting to know who the people are, bringing them together in more of that design thinking, Kathleen, like you've done before, kind of workshopping.
Yeah, I think building trust is demonstrating that you're listening, right?
Yeah.
So it's having the conversation and then showing them that you heard what they said and it's showing up in your requirements, and then it shows up in your digital asset management tool, and then taking ownership that you heard them and showing them that you heard them, right?
Well, also educating them on how you heard them, and sometimes it's drawing it out or the list of requirements and getting their feedback again. Did I understand you correctly?
Exactly.
But also doing the push-pull of, hey, this is really an exciting thing that will make you more efficient. What do you think about this? So you don't spring it on them.
Right.
One of the questions I like to ask a new group is, how many folks use Post-it notes to keep themselves straight? Who does everything on a computer? Because we all have habits, and how we work, how we really work, is what we're changing with DAM. So if you're going to give me something that's going to add more hours to my day because it's really out of my wheelhouse, that's going to be a huge effort, and I'm going to be in resistance the whole time. So trust doesn't exist at all, right?
Right. You also want to try to simplify things, right? You don't want to use a lot of jargon or make things overly complicated for your users because it's not their world, it's ours. So how do you simplify the change, and how do you structure your communications so that they're simple enough that everyone across your org can understand? And that's another way to build trust.
Do you also find that, kind of optimizing those ambassadors that get excited about data and really like want to get involved in DAM, having them be voices in the
Yes.
organization.
Yeah. And often they come from places you would least expect. So I had a conversation with somebody yesterday from our strategy and operations arm who was looking to build a report, and he was talking about it. It was super complex the way he was thinking about it. And I showed him through video conferencing. It took me about 15 seconds to get him the data he needed from my DAM. And he was like, wow, yeah. So, the data's there. He didn't know the data was there because he just thought it was a bunch of assets, which it is also a bunch of assets, but it's also a bunch of data. So in that aspect, now I have a new champion because he's going to tell everyone else in the strategy and ops org that there's this great tool. We can get a lot of data out of it. And he was willing to even go in and help add new tags to content so that he could get the additional reporting he wanted. I'm like, sure.
Wow. That's
I know.
super great.
I know. That was a win-win for me. Thank you.
Definitely. And that's why I start lunch and learns or an internal meetup group so that even when we're onboarding with the core team and we're branching out to those power users and really keeping that engagement going, having subject matter experts internally that have a skill that adds light, or learning from somebody that's your colleague, I think really helps move the DAM forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of all of the things that you do, what have you seen be the most successful? I mean, I know it depends on different cultures, but usually there's one or two things that are kind of the bomb.
So I think the thing that has been most successful as I'm trying to launch a DAM is having design thinking workshops. Because it gets people energized. It's fun. They're talking to other people. They see that their use cases aren't unique. And it helps with that change management. Once a DAM is launched, then I find meeting with individual teams has been most successful. Lunch and learns have been really hit and miss for me.
Yeah, when I've done team sync type things where it's an all-day design thinking workshop, and then we take that and we metabolize all the data, and then we do a share out afterwards. I don't really think you can underestimate just how effective that is of getting everyone really excited on board and behind it, and everyone wants to be part of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I totally agree. I would say design thinking workshops, those kind of things that get people busy together and communicating differently, and that awareness of, hey, you do the same job as I do. I never realized we had so much in common, or wow, I'd like to do it that way. And just opening up that dialogue differently when you're launching a DAM really helps through the life cycle of DAM.
Yeah, and starting with it being fun or perceived as fun is like a huge boost.
Yeah, we did like a innovative Ignite type of thing, and only 25 people were allowed to be invited, and then it was totally facilitated for 8 hours, and then we did takeaways, which that had to be in person. People flew in for that one, which brings up the next question. What do you do when you have how do you heighten engagement especially at the beginning when you're working with stakeholders across the globe?
Well, I think it's interesting because those kind of in person, I really think that's huge, as many as you can get, not all the time, but for those big workshop, it really makes a difference. And then I always give everybody a challenge to come up with the best damn joke, and they'll get a prize at the end, but we don't know what the prize is. And everybody takes it to an nth degree of creating jokes. And so that camaraderie of the design thinking workshops and being engaged, you can have different surveys and contests and things like that, but I really think that the workshopping together and having fun is a huge hit.
Yeah, absolutely. It's harder to do when you are working for a global organization because not everyone can fly in. If there is an annual meeting that you can get a spot in, which sometimes is a long shot, you know,
Mhm.
go for it.
Mhm.
Otherwise, I structure like call-in hours for, you know, I have one morning where I come in really early for our European offices. And then I have one evening where I'm up a little bit later for our offices in Southeast Asia.
I love the idea of office hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did virtual coffees, the same kind of ideas
Mhm.
for, and I do think that works well, especially as the project's building steam. If you can't get, you know, some kind of workshop at an annual global meeting, sometimes it's good to have those stakeholders on the phone, so you're together at least, and then you do a breakout with them at a time that's better for them for their kind of deep dive and repeating some of that stuff that you did with the physical group if they can't stay on the phone.
And record those sessions, right?
Definitely. Oh my gosh. And um,
Because that helps a lot with getting them over that hump of change and feeling like they're remote and whatever else they're going through, which will be hard for you to ascertain because you're not there in person, and it's harder to read people virtually, right?
yeah, and especially if it's a different culture, a different language,
Sure.
and really having those calls and being available to have those calls with one person or a small group really helps your project along, because you come up with things like they really need this in a different language. So you have those conversations about relating assets that are, you know, transcribed or original in a different language, as well as the UI. And different cultures and different languages and different regions all have a different reaction to things, and
Yes.
you want to make sure you're sensitive to that all the time when you're launching and in the DM life cycle.
Yes.
Yeah, one thing I've seen be really effective is if the main stakeholder, like the primary program owner, is the one that does those calls. So they do the actual presenting to APAC and EMEA and, you know, anyone else that needs to be on these calls, South America, and they make the time for it. They don't pass that off to someone in the region or someone else on the team. And I've seen the teams that are outside of the location where the main region is being rolled out first really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of different ways of solving things, and I think you learn as you go, but taking some of these best practice ideas and owning them with what's right for your organization and not being afraid to test something new and having these kind of conversations with your colleagues. I mean, I call Kathleen and Jill and ask their feedback, as well as others in our industry, because I know I don't have all the answers and that there might be a better way of doing it, because things change all the time, right? So we need to open ourselves up to get that kind of collaborative support from other experts and learners.
Yeah, and that's us learning to change, right? Is finding community and then learning from our peers within that community.
That was so well said. Thank you, Kathleen.
And then I think we wanted to touch on governance and why is that the foundation for the change magic?
Yeah, and I think we talked about this last time, Jill, as well, that governance becomes really important for the success, and it is a way to communicate change as well, because often the people on in your governance committee are also your champions, right?
Definitely. And, you know, setting up that governance framework at inception of the champion, your core working team, and then ad hoc members, people that are subject matter experts that don't need to be engaged all the time, at, you know, during your launching phase of implementation and then your rollout, that governance framework might shift, and making it part of your outlook of the project that we're going to have more permanent people in the future. Because a lot of folks, they take it on as a stretch job initially, and then they realize, wow, we really need some full-time employees that do this.
Yeah, I mean, often I think we've seen an organization says we need a digital asset management tool, and then somebody goes and buys one, and then they realize they now need staff to manage that.
Or
I
they
mean,
doesn't recognize it. I had one
yeah,
organization that the controlled vocabulary list didn't mean anything to them. they weren't engaged. They couldn't use a system and they spent $1 million. That is just wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think the other important thing that you get from the government is like a DACY or RACY model where you know who the key decision makers are versus approvers versus contributors versus those that just need to be informed.
Right. And I think
Huge.
that's really important to do for your organization to a certain extent too,
Yep.
right? That helps control your scope and then controls your communication as well.
And some people don't want the responsibility. And when you get organizations like a small group to self-select a point of contact that's going to be responsible, there's somebody that wants to stand up, and sometimes there's somebody that doesn't want that job and they've been put in it. So you kind of flesh that out early on is a good idea.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, should we go ahead and move to questions from the audience or anyone that wants to have a conversation? Maybe we can take everyone off mute and see what you're thinking about all of this.
Can you go back to the last slide, please? Though I like this one.
Of course.
So did you catch my misspelling?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was an editor in a prior life, but it's all good. I like this, and I like how it's plugged in.
Do you have any other comments on it?
And this isn't a question, it's more of a brava. Yeah, when you actually keep it, I do related things, not actually digital asset management, but in the related things, this is where you make sure your system works long term as well.
Right.
Yeah, sustainability and maintainability are huge.
Really like this layout.
You should be thinking about sustainability and maintainability at the beginning of your project.
May I turn that into a question? Have you seen any challenges where something does start to unravel? And what would you recommend to avoid it or fix it?
Depends what it is. And yes, we've seen things unravel all the time. Kathleen, you want to take this?
No.
Jill?
Sure.
It's bringing back PTSD.
Yeah, I mean, coming from the integration world, and so we're constantly scaling and optimizing and automating. I've worked with a lot of huge agencies, and one of their favorite things to do, of course, is have lots and lots of freelancers they bring in and out of the system. So that's a lot of stress on the system in terms of new people that don't know what they're doing and they're looking for things that they have to find right away. What I've seen be most successful there is if we end up with a gotcha, like a blocker of some kind, to go ahead and pause, do the full halt, stop, and reassess, evaluate, be very transparent with everybody to manage expectations that, yep, we found a problem, acknowledge it, own it, let them know how the process is moving along to fix it, ask for help, escalate early and often. That's actually maybe the biggest gotcha of all of these systems, is when somebody is just sure that it's super important for them to fix it personally and to contain it, and that it will look bad for them if it gets out or has to go outside their purview.
You mentioned something really good, Jill, is that part of setting the stage for the project about change is that you're going to learn and repivot. DAM is never done. It is never done. It's part of an ecosystem. It is going to have new users. It's going to be agile to emerging technology, and setting that at the onset of kicking off the initiative when you're going out to buy a dam is really important. If you're taking over a dam and you're repositioning a project, perfect time to have those conversations that, okay, we can have an improvement plan, we can shift, and setting that stage, because it is a constant dam life cycle, right?
Yeah, we've got a question here on what's the difference of change management for DAM or similarities with other types of projects. And I mean, for me, I think the biggest change management issue for DAM is it's inherently got change management involved, whereas other types of systems may evolve less rapidly, they may scale less rapidly, whereas DAM is the way it's used is changing. It's in constant flux. What do you think, Kathleen?
Yeah, I agree. So if you're deploying a project management system, that's a little more static than a digital asset management system, because project management tends to have a really robust nomenclature. You know, there's lots of good practices behind it that a lot of people are familiar with.
Even a PIM actually, I think, has less.
Yeah, even a PIM has
issues.
less too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So digital asset management often starts to unravel a little bit as you're expanding, right? You might start with one team and then add on other teams or add on global teams. And then it can start to break down as you add more people, and if those people aren't following the processes that you've laid out. So if you're not getting good metadata, if you're not getting the right assets, if you're just getting junk or you're not getting anything, then it starts to break apart, right?
Right.
So that's where I've seen a lot of challenges with DAM, where I haven't seen it with other types of tools.
And what's interesting is we have really bad names for systems, and it's confusing to end users. So again, looking at that, intelligent information architecture platform that includes a DAM, a PIM, an MRM, those things are becoming more intelligent. And there's lots of repositories, like a Percolate has a repository in it. And understanding their relationship to DAM and the role and responsibility of the DAM versus the role and the responsibility of that other system is pretty huge to putting your story together for those end users to understand it.
Yeah.
With the question, if it starts to break apart, how do you recover? And I guess I'm thinking you go back to your people, processes, technology, and you make sure you bring them back together.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, it gets back to how do you work versus business processes. If you don't understand how people work, then you can't affect change in a positive way.
Right.
Yeah, I like to say it's not a line, it's a spirograph.
Oh, I love that. I thought it was a three-dimensional kind of, structure with lots of doorways in it at every level, but I think I like the spirograph one.
Well, I'm a child of the 70s. I still have my spirographs.
Well,
so that would be great for a workshop. Let's play.
Yes, exactly. Everyone
so a good one to end on would be, what's your wildest experience with a DAM or the real aha moment? And I have to say, so that would be where the time-space continuum rips, right?
Yes.
Now we've moved to 4 dimensions. Yeah.
Yes, now we've moved to 4 dimensions.
I don't think we can top that one.
I broke one in 20 minutes once.
Ooh.
That was an aha moment. It was an open source repository that was getting a lot of press in higher ed. And I had it deployed, and it was an incredibly siloed system. And I pushed the boundaries and I broke it in 20 minutes. That was an aha moment in what I thought worked structurally from a back-end architecture point of view versus what didn't.
I think the coolest thing I've ever seen done is very large manufacturer of consumer goods that shall remain unnamed was shipping all of their brand assets around the world on disks, absolutely unsecured, and they bought a DAM and deployed it in 6 weeks with a branded interface because they were completely focused on simply securing it with their partners. And I've never seen one done that fast and that well.
Wow.
Pretty impressive. I think it's 7 o'clock. Does anybody have any additional questions for us, or?
There's one final question on what do you do if someone wants a feature the vendor doesn't currently offer? I mean, coming from the systems integration side of things, you're going to do a custom build. Basically, you're going to fork the code and you're going to customize it with an API. And if you bought a system without an API, you should be fired.
Yeah, nowadays with a cloud first mentality, it's interesting, out of the box, there's more enterprise solutions that have more out of the box features and plugins that are vetted, they even resell. Problem is some of them do work, some of them don't work sometimes. So trying to steer into a custom script then instead of custom programming, because again, you always have to think of updates and upgrades, and you don't want to break, because you break, then people are not going to trust the system.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I find it depends on what the ask is, right? So
Yep.
if it's something that you think is going to benefit the vendor's other customers, then I pitch it to them to say, here's a use case. What do you think? Do you think you would develop this? And I've had pretty good luck doing that. And then sometimes it's a matter of leveraging an API to connect to something else.
Yep.
Maybe there's a better tool out there that does additional functionality that you really wouldn't necessarily want as part of your code with a DAM. So you just have to think flexibly about it, I think.
Yeah, and it's about the role and responsibility of
Yes.
each solution and system in, what it is you're trying to solve. And that's why the ecosystem and understanding what else is in that story. It could be in your marketing operations stack. It could be underlying your entire business. It depends on where the dam is placed and what its role is supposed to be, is really looking at maybe that PIM system needs to be updated and you shouldn't integrate with it, or you should do X, Y, and Z. Unless you understand what all the pieces are in connection and who does what and why, you can't do a good assessment.
Right. And I think, again, going back to transparency with your stakeholders, that's how you manage their expectations. You don't promise anything up front. You listen, you evaluate, and then you get back to them.
Right, and it could be that it's 2 years out because it's out of scope, and
Yep.
you communicate in scope, out of scope, future consideration. It's fine to have a parking list where you're, or parking lot list of, yeah, let's look at that later, or even a wish list going.
Yeah.
Because you want to keep people engaged, but you also want to direct traffic.
Yes, exactly.
Perfect. And on that note, thank you so much, Sarah, for the time here with everybody.
Yes.
And
Well, thank you so much for putting all of this together.
Awesome conversation. I loved all the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.